Why did the woman in 13F keep scanning the cabin like that? Jennifer Walsh had served drinks to thousands of passengers over the years, but this one was different. Her posture was too straight. Her eyes followed the crew too closely, every detail. From the way she stowed her bag to the way her hands rested on the armrests, felt deliberate. It was as if the woman was ready for something the rest of the plane didn't know was coming. Sarah Martinez barely noticed the way she looked to others. She had spent 2 decades carrying herself like this. Steady spine, square shoulders, hands positioned with intent. Now, seated beside a stranger in a faded business suit and a laptop balanced on his knees, she let her gaze drift out the oval window, watching the afternoon sun spill across the patchwork farmland of Kansas. For the first time in a year and a half, she wasn't wearing a uniform. The jeans felt odd, stiff against her legs, as though they didn't belong to her life anymore. Her sweater, a soft navy one her sister had given her the Christmas before, last was still so new it smelled faintly of the department store. She'd never worn it until today. The years since had been a blur of desert heat, flight suits, Kevlar, and briefing rooms that reeked of coffee and tension. General Hayes had practically shoved her out the door. "Martinez," she'd said, leaning back in her chair with that half-smile of someone who knew she'd win the argument. "You've been running on caffeine and sheer will for too long. The squadron's home safe. The mission reports are in. If I see you in this building before May 1st, I'll have the MPs drive you to the beach myself." So Sarah booked a commercial flight, something she hadn't done in ages, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., with a layover in Denver, to see her mother. No cockpit, no call sign, no mission. Just another passenger headed east. Jennifer paused beside her row, coffee pot in hand. "Top up?" she asked, with the warm efficiency of someone who'd spent years pouring drinks for people she might never see again. "Please," Sarah said, and watched the steady hand that filled the cup without spilling a drop, even in the slight sway. "A flight." Jennifer hesitated, her eyes taking in the posture, the stillness, the way Sarah's gaze had already swept the cabin. "Military?" she asked quietly, as though the answer might change the air between them. Sarah hesitated. She had hoped to disappear into the anonymity of a crowded flight, to be just another face in the background, but she could see it in Jennifer's expression. The recognition of someone who'd lived in proximity to service. "Air Force," Sarah replied softly. Jennifer's eyes softened in instant understanding. "My husband was Navy, 22 years, 3 deployments to the Gulf, retired last year." A pause, and then, with quiet sincerity, "Thank you," Sarah nodded, the words catching in her throat more than she expected. She'd been thanked before, by strangers in airports, by school kids visiting bases, but today the gratitude seemed to cut deeper, touching the quiet ache she carried in her chest. The cabin around her hummed with the rhythm of civilian life, a businessman murmuring into a Bluetooth headset, his world full of quarterly reports and market projections. A young mother across the aisle juggling twin toddlers who were fascinated by the window shades and overhead bins. A row of college kids laughing too loud, all spring break energy and carelessness. None of them knew. Not about the call sign Phoenix. Not about the night she glimpsed an F-16 home through enemy fire over the Hindu Kush. Every system bleeding out, praying her hydraulics would last another 30 seconds. Not about the distinguished flying cross tucked into a drawer back home, awarded after she'd flown cover over 200 Marines at an outpost on the brink of being overrun. And that was fine. She didn't want them to know. She wanted to remember what normal felt like, to listen to laughter that wasn't tinged with the edge of combat, to see landscapes that weren't marred by impact craters. Her eyes drifted shut. Outside, the farmlands stretched toward a horizon that promised nothing more dangerous than rain clouds. This, she reminded herself, was what she'd fought for. Not speeches about freedom, but the quiet miracle of ordinary people going about ordinary lives. The first sign was so subtle she felt it before she heard it. a faint tremor through the seat frame. Her eyes opened, and the pilot's mind that never really turned off began processing without her permission. Time: 3:47 p.m. Altitude: cruising. Duration into flight: a little over 2 hours. The vibration came again, low frequency, persistent. Not turbulence. Her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. She'd felt this before, over Kandahar. When her Falcon's hydraulic pump began to fail, it was the kind of signal an aircraft gave when something deep in its bones was breaking. The tremor turned into a shudder. Coffee rippled in cups. The businessman beside her frowned, annoyed at the interruption. Across the aisle, the young mother instinctively drew her boys close. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties," came the captain's voice, practiced calm, even. Cadence. The language pilots used when they didn't want anyone to panic. Sarah's stomach sank. She had spoken those exact words herself with an engine on fire. The shudder grew violent. Overhead bins rattled. A phone skittered across the floor, somewhere. Behind her, conversation stopped mid-laugh. Then came the sound no passenger ever wants to hear. A grinding metallic screech from deep within the fuselage. 3 seconds long, but enough for her trained mind to run through every likely cause. Multiple hydraulic systems failing. Flight controls reverting to manual. The pilots up front wrestling against hundreds of thousands of pounds with muscle alone. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency procedures, the captain said next. Passengers, review your safety cards and prepare for a possible emergency landing. Emergency. The words sliced through the cabin like a blade. Oxygen masks dropped with a heavy thunk. Gasps, prayers, someone crying out in panic. Sarah pulled her mask into place in one efficient movement. Through the small oval window, the world tilted sharply as the nose dropped. Not a gentle descent, a fight between man, machine, and gravity. Around her, chaos bloomed. A businessman hyperventilating into his mask. The young mother fumbling to fit the masks on 2 wriggling boys. Voices rising, some in prayer, others in raw fear. Sarah's mind slid into the cold. Clarity that had saved her life in combat more times than she could count. She recognized the signs. Multiple hydraulic failure. Likely a ruptured main distribution line. Flight controls barely responsive. The aircraft was in an uncontrolled descent, and if something didn't change soon, 127 people were going to hit the Colorado landscape far faster than physics allowed for survival. But she wasn't in the cockpit. She was a passenger in jeans and a sweater, officially powerless. The thing was, she'd never been good at accepting powerlessness. Her eyes found Jennifer in the aisle, moving quickly between rows, checking on passengers. Sarah reached out, catching her arm, firm, but not panicked. "I need to talk to the captain," she said, using the kind of voice that cut through radio chatter in combat zones. Jennifer started to give the standard response. "Ma'am, please remain seated. I'm a pilot." Sarah interrupted. "United States Air Force. I've dealt with multiple hydraulic failures before. I can help." Jennifer's eyes flicked. Between Sarah's calm face and the increasingly unstable cabin, protocol screamed no. Instinct said yes. "What kind of pilot?" she asked. "Fighter, F-16s, mostly. I've brought damaged aircraft home before." The plane lurched again. That decided it. Jennifer pulled the master key from her pocket. "Follow me." What would you do if the only thing standing between you and disaster was a stranger in jeans? That was the thought running through Jennifer Walsh's mind as she led Sarah Martinez toward the front of the Boeing 757. The aisle tilted just enough to make walking feel like climbing a slope. Overhead, masks swayed in the air currents, oxygen hoses twisting with each jolt of the plane. Passengers turned their heads as Sarah passed, catching fragments of her conversation with Jennifer, words like pilot and Air Force hung in the air, whispered from row to row like lifelines. Near the galley, Sarah paused and picked up the intercom. She didn't bother with introductions to the crew. She spoke to everyone. "This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force," she said, voice calm, measured, the way you talk to people when you need them to believe in you. "I want everyone to listen carefully. We are going to get through this, but you need to stay calm and follow all instructions from the flight crew. The pilots are doing everything they can. I'm going to help them bring us home safely." Her words hit the cabin like a stabilizing force. The crying softened. The frantic whispers faded into stillness. People turned toward her voice the way lost hikers turn toward a signal flare. One passenger, the businessman from 13E, caught her arm as she stepped past. "You're really Air Force?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, with a brief squeeze to his shoulder. "And we're going to be fine." Jennifer slid the cockpit key into the lock and twisted. The reinforced door clicked open to reveal a world of concentrated chaos. Captain Mike Thompson sat in the left seat, his knuckles white on the yoke. Beside him, First Officer Lisa Chun ran through emergency procedures from memory, flipping switches and adjusting levers with precision born of countless hours in the simulator. But her jaw was tight, and her breathing was fast. The cockpit was cooler than the cabin, the air smelling faintly of heated electronics and sterile tang of oxygen. Sarah stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Closing the door behind her, "Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force," she announced. "I can help." Thompson shot her a glance. Jeans, sweater, civilian, shoes. But before he could dismiss her, she started talking. "You've lost primary hydraulics. Backup is failing or already gone. You're getting maybe 15% authority on your flight controls, and you're using differential thrust to hold heading. That's why your angle of attack is creeping. You've got 10 minutes before this becomes unrecoverable." It took her 12 seconds to read their situation like an open book. First Officer Chun blinked, recognition dawning. "She's right, Mike." Thompson exhaled hard. "Nearest airport is Denver. 18 minutes at this speed." "Too far," Sarah said immediately. "We need military fields on the board. Long runways, crash gear already staged. Air Force Academy, Buckley, Peterson. Anything in range." She slipped into the jump seat behind them, strapping in as if she'd done it 1,000 times, which she had, just never in a 757. "How do you—" Thompson began. "Because I've been here," Sarah cut in. "Different airframe. Same failure. I landed an F-16 over the Hindu Kush with no hydraulics. Your Boeing has redundancies, my Falcon didn't, but the physics haven't changed." She reached for the headset and keyed the mic. "Denver Center, United 847. This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force, call sign Phoenix. Assisting the flight crew with emergency procedures. Request immediate vector to nearest. Suitable runway and full emergency services." Silence, just long enough for Sarah to picture controllers staring at their scopes, processing the name they just heard. When the reply came, the voice on frequency had changed. "United 847, Denver Center. Confirm call sign Phoenix." "Confirmed?" Sarah said. A beat. Then, "Phoenix is on station. Vectoring you now." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Phoenix?" Sarah's gaze stayed on the instrument panel. "Long story. Let's just say people tend to listen when they hear it." The Boeing lurched. A sudden yaw to the left that took muscle to counter. Sarah's mind was already running the math. Airspeed, altitude, distance to the field. "Mike, I'm going to ask you to do things that feel wrong for a commercial jet. They're not in your manuals, but they work." "Then tell me what you need," Thompson said. And she heard it, the moment trust replaced doubt. 200 miles away, in the radar room at Langley Air Force Base, someone said, "You're not going to believe this. Phoenix is flying a civilian." The story was already spreading like wildfire. Across the country, retired and active duty pilots were tuning in, trading scraps of information over secure channels. At Buckley Space Force Base, Major Kevin "Hawk" Rodriguez dropped his weather notes and stood. Guardian Angel mission. He told his wingman, Captain Amy Chun. Civilian 757. Hydraulics gone. Phoenix is aboard. Amy froze. That Phoenix? Rodriguez was already moving toward the ready room. Grab your gear. We're launching in 4. Minutes later, 2 F-22 Raptors clawed into the Colorado sky, afterburners scorching the late afternoon light, back in the 757 cockpit. Sarah felt the subtle shift in pressure as the fighters joined formation. Hawk Flight Phoenix, she called over the air-to-air frequency. Good to hear you. Phoenix, Hawk, we've got you visual, Rodriguez replied. His tone was steady, but she could hear the undercurrent. The kind of alert readiness you only hear when one pilot is trusting another with their life. What do you need? Sarah's eyes flicked to the altimeter. Runway 16R at Denver. Clear it and hold it. I want every crash rig you can find. And Hawk, throw the approach manual out the window. We're coming in steep, fast, and maybe sideways, Rodriguez. Didn't even hesitate. Copy all. First Officer Chun's voice was calm as she called out their speed and altitude. But Sarah could see the sweat tracing a line down her temple. The jet was flying. Yes, but only just. She leaned closer to Thompson. This is going to feel like a test flight. We'll come in hotter than normal, ride the edge of stall, and use every inch of that runway. No flaring for a smooth landing. We fly it on. The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. I've never landed like that. Sarah's voice softened just a fraction. And I've never been a passenger. Guess we're both out of our comfort zones today. At Denver International, Fire Chief Robert Martinez, no relation, stood in the mobile command unit, scanning a line of emergency vehicles that stretched the length of 16R39. Rigs, he said into the radio. Foam, medevac, hazmat, crash recovery, everything we've got. This landing is going to be unconventional. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Maria Santos, still holding her twins close, had started telling people what she'd overheard. The woman helping in the cockpit was a decorated Air Force colonel, a pilot, famous for saving lives. By the time Jennifer made her final pass through the aisles, the rumor had spread to every row. Ladies and gentlemen, she said into the PA, the pilot assisting our crew is Colonel Sarah Martinez, call sign Phoenix, one of the most distinguished aviators in Air Force history. We are in exceptional hands. Heads turned toward the front, toward the door where Sarah had vanished. Fear still lived in their eyes, but something else was there now too, hope. As the nose of the Boeing dipped into its final vector toward Denver, Sarah tightened her harness and glanced once at the captain. You ready? She asked. He met. Her eyes, a ghost of a smile on his face. Let's go to work, Phoenix. What goes through your mind when the runway you're aiming for feels too far and the clock is running out? For Sarah Martinez, the answer was simple. You think about physics, muscle, and trust, and nothing else. The F-22s settled into perfect formation off the 757's wingtips, their gray silhouettes sharp against the pale blue afternoon sky. In another life, she might have been flying one of them, but today, her battlefield was this wounded Boeing. Its control surfaces sluggish, its hydraulics bleeding life with every mile. Hawk Phoenix, she said into the headset. We're starting descent. Tell Denver Tower this approach is going to be military style. High energy, steep angle, minimal time on final. We can't afford to nurse her down. Copy. Phoenix, Major Rodriguez replied. Tower's been briefed. Runway 16R is yours. Full emergency services in place. Sarah's eyes swept the instrument panel again. Airspeed, altitude, control response. The 757's yoke felt heavier in Thompson's hands than it had 20 minutes ago. The kind of stiffness that came when hydraulic assist was all but gone. She'd flown aircraft with worse, but never one carrying over 100 civilians who had no choice but to trust her. "Mike," she said, leaning forward, "we're going to have to overfly the normal glide path. Keep our descent steep until short final. If we try to drag her in shallow, you'll lose elevator authority and we'll sink hard." Thompson nodded. "Got it. What about speed?" "Faster than you've ever landed a Boeing," Sarah said without hesitation. "We keep the airflow high to keep what's left of your control surfaces effective. That means we hit the runway hot, then ride reverse thrust like our lives depend on it, because they do." First Officer Chun was already flipping through the approach checklist. Adjusting for the new plan, her voice stayed calm as she confirmed settings, but her eyes flicked to Sarah with something like quiet awe. "Colonel, I've read about your Afghanistan incident." Sarah didn't look up. "Then you know this is nothing compared to that. On the ground at Denver International, the scene on and around 16R looked less like an airport and more like a forward operating base waiting for a medevac. Dozens of fire engines and ambulances lined the taxiways, red lights cutting through the afternoon haze. Crash recovery crews in yellow gear stood beside their rigs, radios crackling. State patrol vehicles blocked access roads. Even from a mile away, you could hear the thrum of helicopter rotors as National Guard medevac birds held station inside. The airport's operations center monitors showed live radar of United 847's approach, two small fighter icons flanking the larger return of the 757. "ETA to threshold is 7 minutes, one controller reported. Aircraft appears stable." On descent, Airport Director Susan Morrison leaned over his shoulder. "Stable's not good enough. I want emergency crews moving as soon as those wheels touch." In the passenger cabin, the air was different now. Fear still lingered, but there was a cohesion to it, like soldiers in a trench who've accepted the fight ahead. Robert Kim, the businessman, had closed his laptop for good and was sitting forward, watching out the window at the escorts pacing them. "Those fighters? They're here for her, aren't they?" he asked the college student beside him. "Yeah," the kid said. "My brother's in the Air Force. He told me about Phoenix once, said she's like a legend." Maria Santos, 2 rows up, overheard, and smiled faintly despite herself. "She's the reason we're going to make it home." Back in the cockpit, the altimeter unwound steadily. "Passing 8,000, Chun reported. "Speed 200 knots, Thompson added, his voice tight but controlled. Sarah watched the runway grow in the distance, a pale ribbon of concrete stretching across the Colorado plains. "Mike, you're going to feel the sink rate kick in about a mile out. Don't fight it too early. Let her settle, then flare just enough to keep the nose from slamming. We want main gear first, then drop the nose hard to get reverse thrust on as soon as possible." He glanced at her. "You ever land one of these?" "No," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "But I've landed aircraft with less to work with than you've got right now, trust me." 5 miles out, the cockpit radio crackled. "United 847 Denver Tower. You are clear to land any runway, any configuration. All traffic diverted." Sarah pressed the transmit button. "Copy, Tower. Phoenix is on final. Stand by." At the same moment, inside the Buckley Space Force Base ready room, a crowd of off-duty personnel gathered around a maze. "Live a TC feed." Every voice in the room went quiet when Sarah's transmission came through. "That's her," someone whispered. 2 miles. Chum called. "Speed 185. Sarah's voice dropped to that low, steady register she used in the middle of firefights. "All right, Mike." "Write it in." No hesitation. The runway was filling the windshield now. Thompson eased the yoke back, the 757 responding sluggishly, like a tired animal. 100 feet. Chun called. Sarah leaned in, eyes on the horizon. "Flare!" "Now, hold!" The main landing gear hit the runway with a deep, rolling thud. No bounce, no drift. Just raw contact. "Drop the nose," Sarah ordered, and Thompson shoved it forward, the nose gear slamming down. Reverse thrust. Full. The engines roared, the cabin shuddered, and the speed bled off in gut-wrenching increments. 80 knots. 60, 50. Emergency vehicles paced them along the taxiway, crews ready to jump if anything failed. 30. 20, 10. The aircraft came to a stop 800 yards from the end of the runway. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the cooling engines and the faint wail of approaching sirens. Thompson sat back, eyes closed. The adrenaline starting to break. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver." In the cabin, the reaction was instant. Cheers, sobs, people clapping so hard their hands stung. Maria hugged her boys, whispering into their hair. Robert Kim wiped at his eyes. And near the back, a college student pulled out his phone and started typing. "Phoenix just landed my flight. Sarah stayed in the cockpit long enough to help with the shutdown checklist. Only when she was sure the 757 was safe did she unstrap. Mike, Lisa," she said quietly. "The emergencies. Not over until everyone's on the ground." They both nodded as she stepped through the forward door. Sarah stopped cold on the tarmac below. In a neat formation stood more than 50 military personnel. Active duty, retired, guard, flight suits, dress blues, ABUs. Some she recognized instantly. Others were strangers who had simply come because they'd heard Phoenix was here. At the front, Major Rodriguez stood at attention, flanked by his wingman, Captain Amy Chun. Colonel Martinez, Rodriguez called, voice carrying over the idling trucks and the click of camera shutters. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and the aviation community, request permission to render honors." Sarah swallowed hard, then straightened to parade rest. "Permission granted," Rodriguez saluted. So did Amy. Then, like a wave, every single uniformed person on the tarmac snapped to attention and saluted. And for the first time that day, Sarah felt her breath catch. Why do some moments feel heavier than the air they occupy? For Sarah Martinez, it wasn't the grinding descent or the fight against failing hydraulics that tightened her throat. It was standing at the top of the aircraft stairs, looking down at a line of uniforms stretched across the tarmac, all saluting her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows behind them, making each figure seem taller, sharper. Their boots formed a perfect row against the painted lines of the service road. The salute was crisp, synchronized, and silent, a language she understood better than any spoken one. She stepped forward, returning the salute with the same precision she'd learned as a cadet 26 years ago. The motion was muscle memory, but the weight behind it was new. These weren't just Air Force members paying respects to a colonel. They were warriors, acknowledging one of their own, honoring the way she had once again answered the call without hesitation. When she lowered her hand, Major Rodriguez broke formation and walked toward her. He still wore his flight suit from the escort mission, the faint scent of jet fuel clinging to the fabric. "Phoenix," he said simply. "Hawk," she replied. The handshake was firm but brief. Behind him, Captain Amy Chun approached, her eyes bright in a way that only comes after adrenaline and relief collide. "You scared the hell out of us," Amy said with a small, incredulous smile. "And then you made it look easy." Sarah shook her head. "There was nothing easy about it. Mike and Lisa flew her home. I just gave them a few extra tools." From behind, another voice cut in, older, grittier. "Still making the impossible look routine, huh?" She turned and saw Master Sergeant Tony Castellanos, a man she'd served with years ago at Bagram. He'd aged, the hair more salt than pepper now, but his eyes were the same. "Tony," she said, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "For the first time in hours, you're still in the fight." "I was until I heard your voice on the emergency frequency," he said. "Then I figured I'd better be here when you landed." just in case you needed someone to buy the first round." Sarah laughed, the sound foreign in her own ears after 3 hours of tightly controlled focus. The first passengers began stepping off the portable stairs. An 8-year-old boy in a bright red hoodie clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide as he took in the emergency vehicles and the military formation. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at her arm, "look, they're all saluting." Linda Wilson followed his gaze and felt a lump rise in her throat. She'd overheard bits of conversation in the cabin about an Air Force colonel, about a legend called Phoenix, but seeing the military honors brought it home in a way nothing else could. Her family was alive because of the woman standing at the foot of those stairs. Maria Santos emerged next with her twin boys. She paused halfway down, scanning the scene until she spotted Sarah. For a moment, neither spoke, but Maria's eyes glistened with unspoken gratitude. Sarah inclined her head in a subtle acknowledgement, the kind that passed between people who'd shared danger and come through together. Robert Kim followed, carrying nothing but the suit jacket he'd worn on board, the laptop, the briefcase, the documents. All of it seemed irrelevant now. He stopped in front of Sarah and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice unsteady. I don't have the right words. You just said them," Sarah replied. More passengers approached, some quietly, some with emotion they didn't bother to hide. One of the college students, the one who had prayed in Spanish during the descent, asked for a photo. Another passenger held out a boarding pass for an autograph. And then the boy in the red hoodie was back, this time without his mother, looking up at Sarah with fearless curiosity. "Ma'am, are you really a fighter pilot?" Sarah crouched so they were eye level. "I am, and today, I gotta help Captain Thompson and First Officer Chun fly your airplane home." "My dad says fighter pilots are the bravest people in the world," the boy said seriously. "Are you brave?" Sarah considered the question. "I think bravery is just doing what needs to be done when people are counting on you. And today, everyone on that airplane was brave. Your mom, the other passengers, the crew, we all worked together." He grinned. "Will you sign my boarding pass?" She took the crumpled slip from his hand and wrote, "To Danny, remember that heroes are ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Aim high. Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez, USAFBY." Now, the media had gathered behind a designated barrier, cameras trained on the tarmac. The sound of shutters clicking was constant, capturing a moment that would be splashed across front pages and broadcast around the world before the night was over. Sarah felt the eyes on her, but kept her focus on the people right in front of her. These were the ones who had lived it, who had felt the shudder of the airframe, heard the grinding of damaged systems, and then trusted her enough to follow her voice through the chaos. As the last passenger cleared the stairs, Captain Thompson and First Officer Chun emerged from the aircraft, the applause from the military formation shifted toward them, and Sarah stepped back so they could take their place in the moment. "Mike, Lisa," she said quietly when they joined her. "This was your airplane, your crew. I was just a passenger who refused to stay in her seat." Thompson shook his head. "I've been in the left seat for 23 years. Colonel, I've had engine failures, lightning strikes, medical emergencies, but I've never had a passenger walk into my cockpit, read my problem in under 15 seconds, and then give me the confidence to do what we just did. You didn't just help us land. You saved us." Chun's voice was softer, but no less certain. "You turned a nightmare into a story we can tell our families. And you reminded me why I started flying in the first place." Somewhere in the background, a fire crew chief called over the radio to confirm the aircraft was secure. The foam rigs stood down. Ambulances returned to standby. The medevac helicopters peeled away toward their hangars. The crisis, for everyone except the investigators, was over as the formation of military personnel began to break. People stepped forward to speak with her one-on-one. She recognized Captain Janet Spike Williams, a pilot she had mentored years ago, now wearing the rank of instructor herself. "You taught me energy management and damaged aircraft," Spike said with a grin. "Looks like you still got it." Chief Master Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, the senior enlisted from her Afghanistan deployment, came next. "Phoenix," he said simply, using her call sign the way one might say friend. "You brought us all home back then. You brought them home today. Some things don't change." But it wasn't the military faces that stayed with her when she finally stepped away from the aircraft. It was the civilians, the businessman without his briefcase, the young mother with 2 tired boys, the college students whose laughter had returned in bursts during the slow walk toward the terminal. They would go back to their lives, maybe tell the story at dinner parties or over coffee, maybe downplay it, maybe relive it in quiet moments. But they would all carry a piece of this day. So would she, from somewhere behind her. Rodriguez's voice called out again, this time informal. "Phoenix, you coming to the hangar later? There's a lot of people who want to buy you a drink." Sarah turned, a half smile tugging at her mouth. "We'll see. Right now, I think I'm going to find my mom." As she walked toward the terminal, the sound of jets taking off in the distance rose above the hum of tarmac activity. She looked toward the horizon, where contrails cut across the fading light, and felt the familiar pull of the sky, the place she spent her life. But today, she had found something on the ground, worth holding on to. What happens after the storm? For most passengers on United 847, it was as simple as stepping onto solid ground, breathing air that wasn't pressurized, and feeling their knees go weak from the weight of relief. But for Sarah Martinez, stepping away from the aircraft was like stepping out of one life and into another she hadn't asked for. The walk to the terminal felt longer than it should have. She could still hear the faint applause echoing from the tarmac behind her. People had begun to peel away, the military formation dissolving, emergency crews packing up equipment, reporters shouting questions that bounced uselessly against the security cordon. Jennifer Walsh caught up to her just before the jet bridge entrance. The flight attendant's hair had come loose from its bun, but her eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like pride. "Colonel." Jennifer hesitated, then shook her head. "Sarah, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen passengers step up in medical emergencies, help calm others during turbulence, even help subdue a drunk, but I've never seen someone walk into a cockpit and change the ending of the story." Sarah gave a tired smile. "The crew did the hard work. I just knew what buttons to press." Jennifer's reply was quiet. "You pressed more than buttons. You pressed hope into that cabin when we were losing it." They stood there for a moment, the terminal's fluorescent glow spilling into the jet bridge. Finally, Sarah nodded. "Take care of yourself, Jennifer, and tell your husband. Welcome home. For good." In the baggage claim area, the chaos of the emergencies seemed strangely distant. Suitcases rolled on the carousel. The hum of casual conversation was interrupted only by the occasional laughter or sigh of relief from a cluster of passengers who had shared the flight. Maria Santos was kneeling beside her twin boys, showing them a small souvenir patch one of the F-22 pilots had given her on the tarmac. "See this? It's from the pilot's jacket. You can keep it." The boys traced the stitching with their fingers as if it were a treasure map. Robert Kim stood a few yards away, phone to his ear. Yeah, I'm fine," he was saying, his voice quieter than usual. "No, you don't understand. We shouldn't be fine. She's the reason." Sarah noticed them all in passing, but didn't interrupt. Some moments belonged to the people who had lived them, and didn't need her to frame them. Upstairs in the terminal's mezzanine, the media was still camped out. Security kept them at bay, but Sarah could feel the heat of their lenses, tracking her every step. "Colonel, how did you know what to do?" "Phoenix, can you describe the landing? Are you still on active duty?" She kept walking, not because she was avoiding them, but because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't turn a day of survival into a headline. She found her mother waiting near the security exit, a small woman with silver hair and a cardigan that hung a little loose on her frame. The moment their eyes met, Sarah felt something in her chest crack open. Her mother didn't rush forward or make a scene. She simply took Sarah's hands in hers, holding them as if confirming she was real. "You're here," her mother said. "I'm here," Sarah replied. For a few seconds, neither spoke. All the noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background. The rolling suitcases, the boarding calls, the occasional shout of a gate agent. Then her mother said, with a faint smile, "You weren't supposed to be working today." Sarah almost laughed. "I wasn't." By the time they left the airport, the sky over Denver was painted in streaks of gold and violet. The rush hour traffic crawled, giving her too much time to think. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the weight of the yoke in Thompson's hands. Hear the metallic groan of a wounded aircraft straining against gravity. And beneath that, the sound of voices, not the chatter of radios or the clipped urgency of a TC, but the quieter, more human sounds from the cabin. A whispered prayer, a mother's reassurance, a businessman's shaky "thank you." Those were the sounds that stayed. Later that night, in a hotel room that smelled faintly of detergent and air conditioning, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through her phone. She didn't usually check social media, but tonight curiosity got the better of her. The hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag Phoenix 847, hashtag Bring Them Home, hashtag Seat 13F. Posts from people she didn't know filled the feed. "My brother's alive tonight because of a woman named Phoenix. If you know, flew with her once during a joint exercise you couldn't ask for. Steady your hands in a storm. My kids think she's a superhero, honestly. So do I." There were even photos, grainy shots from the cabin, blurry images of her on the tarmac, the clean frame of her salute. Someone had already made a side-by-side of her recruitment poster from years ago and a still from today. The caption read, "Some legends don't fade. They just keep flying." Sarah put the phone down. The praise was uncomfortable. She hadn't done it for recognition in her mind. There had only been a problem and a solution, and she'd stepped into the space between the two because that's what you do. But she also knew that the ripples from today's flight would travel farther than she could see. At Buckley Space Force Base, the after-action chatter was still going. Pilots from other squadrons had stopped by the ready room to hear the story directly from Rodriguez and Chun. She walked in. "Read our situation in 12 seconds, and then?" Rodriguez shook his head, still half in disbelief. It was like watching an instructor take over a check ride, except the check ride was life or death. Captain Amy Chun added, "You could feel the energy in the cockpit change the moment." She started talking. "We weren't just flying to survive anymore. We were flying to win." At Langley, her old commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, was finishing a late meeting when a junior officer knocked on the door. "She did it, sir." "Landed them safe." Webb leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Of course she did." And in homes across the country, veterans who had flown with her or been saved by her were telling their families the story. The names of the passengers didn't matter. What mattered was that Phoenix had been in the air, and that had been enough. Back in her hotel room, Sarah sat in the dark with only the hum of the AC for company. She thought about something she'd once told a class of cadets at the Air Force Academy. Service isn't the uniform. It's the choice you make when no one else can do what needs doing. Today had reminded her that she was still living that choice. Even off-duty, even in civilian clothes outside her window. The lights of Denver glowed in the distance. Somewhere beyond them was runway 16R. Quiet now, its concrete still holding the memory of a hot, steep approach that had defied every manual and checklist. She closed her eyes and saw the faces again. The young mother, the boy in the red hoodie, the businessman, the crew. She didn't know if she'd ever see them again, but she knew they'd carried something away from today that wasn't just survival. And so had she. Why do some stories refuse to fade? 3 months had passed since United 847 touched down on Denver's runway 16R. But for Sarah Martinez, the day still lived in the quiet moments, in the echo of hydraulics groaning under strain, in the smell of overheated electronics, in the silence that followed the salute on the tarmac. It was early spring at the Air Force Academy. The foothills of the Rockies still carried streaks of snow, and cadets in dark blue marched across the parade ground in tight formation. Sarah stood off to the side in her service dress uniform, watching them move like one living organism. The sound of boots on pavement was as precise and steady as a metronome. She was here to speak. Officially, it was part of a leadership lecture series. Unofficially, everyone knew the story they wanted to hear. The lecture hall was packed. Rows of cadets filled every seat, the overflow spilling into the aisles. They'd read about her in after-action write-ups, seen her face in grainy photos online, heard pieces of the United 847 story from instructors. But this was different. She was here, in the room, and the hum of anticipation was thick. She started without ceremony. 3 months ago, I was in seat 13F. On my way to visit my mother. I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't on orders. I wasn't expecting to do anything except land, grab a coffee, and catch up with family. That's the way most days start, ordinary, until they're not. The room was silent. When the flight crew lost hydraulics, my brain did what years of training taught it to do. Run the scenario, evaluate, decide, act. But that decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on decades of checklists, simulations, near misses, and the voices of instructors who pushed me harder than I thought I could stand. It was built on the mistakes I survived, the missions I shouldn't have come back from, and the people I'd seen pay the cost when luck ran out. Her gaze swept the room. If you think service only happens when you're on duty, wearing the patch, you're wrong. It's a mindset you carry everywhere on the flight line. In a grocery store, in 13F on a commercial flight, you don't get to choose when the moment comes. You only get to choose how you answer it. She didn't tell the cadets everything. She left out the way her hands had trembled after the landing, or how she'd spent half the night staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have happened if she'd hesitated. She didn't tell them about the messages from passengers, the kind that made her chest tighten in ways combat never had. Instead, she told them what mattered for their future. She talked about staying calm when others couldn't, about reading the situation faster than fear could take hold, about the difference between authority and trust, and she told them something she'd learned long before United 847. Sometimes the people who need you most won't be the ones you expect. And sometimes you'll be the only one in the room who can do the thing that needs doing. That's not an accident. That's the reason you've trained. Afterward, the cadets swarmed her. They wanted photos, handshakes, advice. One young woman in the front row lingered until the others had moved on. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with something unsaid. "I want to be a fighter pilot. My dad says it's a long shot." Sarah smiled faintly. Long shots are just targets that need more time in the scope. Put in the work, and the odds stop mattering. The cadet nodded, and Sarah recognized the look, the same one she'd had when someone she admired told her it could be done. In the weeks after the landing, the Air Force had quietly debriefed her, collecting details for their files. There'd been media requests, book offers, even a call from a film studio. She turned them all down. Why? Her mother had asked one evening over dinner, "Because the story isn't about me." Sarah had said, "It's about what happens when training meets the moment, and about all the hands that made that landing possible. Mike, Lisa, the F-22s, the tower crews, the passengers who stayed calm." But the truth was more complicated. The part she never said out loud was that she didn't want the day to become a commodity. Some things deserve to live in the hearts of those who were there, unshaped by scripts and headlines. Still, The story found its way into places she hadn't expected. At a civilian airport in Texas, a flight attendant told passengers during the safety briefing, "And remember, sometimes the heroes are already sitting among you in an ROTC classroom." In Ohio, an instructor pulled up the United 847 incident as a case study in crisis leadership. And in a hangar at Nellis, a group of pilots raised a toast to Phoenix before stepping to their jets. On a quiet afternoon not long after her academy talk, Sarah sat alone in her mother's backyard. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and distant rain. Her mother was inside, humming in the kitchen. Sarah leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. For once, the memories didn't come with the sharp edge of adrenaline. Instead, she found herself thinking about the boy in the red hoodie, asking if she was brave, about Maria Santa's silent nod, about Robert Kim's trembling handshake. Those faces had become part of her own story, just as much as the missions over Afghanistan or the endless hours in the simulator. She realized something then, something she wished she'd said to the cadets. Bravery wasn't a switch you flipped on when the alarm sounded. It was a series of small choices, made long before the crisis, that shaped how you'd respond when it came. She opened her eyes and looked toward the horizon, where a contrail cut a thin white line across the pale blue sky. Somewhere up there, another crew was going through a checklist. Another passenger was looking out the window, unaware of how quickly things could change. And somewhere, inevitably, another moment was waiting for someone, somewhere, to choose to act. What do you say to someone whose life you've changed forever when you barely remember their face? Sarah Martinez didn't have an answer to that. She wasn't expecting to see any of the passengers from United 847 again, not in a city like San Antonio, not in the middle of a quiet Wednesday afternoon. She'd stopped into a small cafe near the River Walk after a morning of meetings. It was the kind of place with scratched wooden tables, the smell of espresso in the air, and a chalkboard. Menu written in uneven letters. She was halfway through her coffee when she heard someone say, very softly, "Phoenix?" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be the name. Her call sign hit like a cold wind. She looked up. A man stood near the counter, holding a paper cup. He was older than she remembered, though maybe that was just because the last time she'd seen him, he'd been pale, tense, and staring out a cabin window at two F-22s, pacing them through the sky. "Robert Kim," he said, walking over. It took her a second to place him. "Seat 14A, she said. His smile was quick, almost embarrassed. "That's right. You remembered. Some things stick," she replied. They sat down, the coffee growing cold between them as the conversation wound its way from polite to personal. He told her about his daughter's wedding, about how he'd taken time off work since the flight, something he said he'd never done in 20 years. "I used to think every day was about getting ahead," he said. "Then I found myself on a plane wondering if I'd see my family again. It changes things." Sarah nodded. She knew that truth well. He hesitated, then said, "I never got to tell you. My wife still doesn't know how close it was. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the details, but I tell my friends. And I tell them it wasn't the pilots alone who saved us. It was the woman in 13F who walked into that cockpit like she'd been sent there." She shifted in her chair. "I was just another set of hands. They would have landed without me." Robert shook his head slowly. "No, Colonel. I was sitting behind the bulkhead. I heard the tone in their voices before you came in. And after, it wasn't just skill you brought. It was certainty. You gave them that. And when you give the people in charge certainty, you give everyone hope." They talked for nearly an hour. When they finally stood to leave, Robert extended his hand, then paused. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but you are a hero, whether you want the title or not." Sarah didn't answer right away. She just returned his handshake and said, "Take care of yourself, Robert." That night, in her hotel room, His words kept circling back, whether you want the title or not. The Air Force had taught her that heroism wasn't a solo act. It was the result of training, teamwork, and sometimes luck. Yet she couldn't deny that her decision to act had tipped the balance on United 847. She thought about the cadet who'd asked if she could be a fighter pilot, about the boy in the red hoodie wanting to know if she was brave, about Maria Santos and her twin boys, clutching each other in the aisle after the landing. Was it possible that the act of stepping forward, not the landing itself, was what people saw as heroic? Weeks later, she got her answer in a way she didn't expect. She was invited to speak at a civilian aviation safety forum in Seattle. It was the kind of event filled with industry veterans, regulators, and airline executives. Her talk was straightforward. A breakdown of the technical decisions made in the cockpit, framed around training principles and emergency protocols. When she stepped off the stage, a woman in the audience stood up. "I'm Maria Santos," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Sarah froze. Maria walked forward, her eyes glistening. "You probably don't remember me. Row 22, twin boys, terrified out of my mind. But you came down that aisle after we landed. You didn't just get us to the ground. You looked at me like we were already safe. And in that moment, I believed you." The room was silent except for Maria's voice. "That's what I tell my sons now. When something scares them, I say, remember the woman who told us we were already safe." Sarah swallowed hard, unable to find the right words. "Maria, I remember you, and your boys. They were brave." Maria shook her head gently. "They were 8 years old. They borrowed their bravery from you." That night, alone in her hotel, Sarah realized the truth she'd been circling since Denver. It wasn't about being a hero in the sense people imagined, capes, medals, speeches. It was about presence, about being the calm in someone else's storm, even when your own hands were shaking. Maybe that was why people kept calling her Phoenix, not just because she'd flown into the fire and come back out, but because, for a moment, she'd given others the chance to rise too. Back at Buckley a few weeks later, she found Rodriguez in the squadron break room. He was sipping bad coffee and flipping through a flight manual. "You know," he said without looking up, "people are going to keep calling you a hero. You can't stop them. Best you can do is decide what to do with it." "And what's that?" she asked. He finally looked at her, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Use it to make more of them. When do you know a story is finished?" For Sarah Martinez, it wasn't when United 847 rolled to a stop on Denver's runway. It wasn't when the passengers stepped into the terminal, or when the salute on the tarmac faded into memory. It wasn't even after the headlines moved on. It came months later, in a moment no one photographed. The day had been ordinary: errands in town, paperwork at her desk, a run through the park. Evening settled soft and golden over Colorado Springs, the air carrying that clean, sharp smell of the mountains. She was sitting on her back porch, a mug of coffee in her hands, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Colonel Martinez. This is Danny, the kid in the red hoodie from the plane. I'm using my mom's phone. I just wanted to tell you I joined Civil Air Patrol today. I'm gonna learn to fly. I hope I can be like you someday." She stared at the screen for a long moment, the edges of the message blurring as her eyes watered. It wasn't the kind of thing that made the news. No one outside of them would ever know, but it was the kind of thing that mattered. That weekend, she drove out to a small airfield where the local Civil Air Patrol squadron met. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She stood at the back of the hangar while the cadets ran through drills, the smell of avgas mixing with the metallic tang of tools and oil. Danny was there, hair a little longer, hoodie replaced with a crisp cadet uniform. He was focused, listening hard to his instructor. He didn't see her. She didn't step forward. Some moments are better left as gifts, unannounced, untouched. She left before the drills ended, content to know the seed had taken root. Life settled back into its rhythm. She flew occasionally with the guard, mentored younger pilots, and spoke in a handful of events. She never used the word hero. She never let them print it in her introductions. But she didn't flinch anymore when she heard it, because she'd come to understand something Rodriguez had been trying to tell her. That day in the break room, it wasn't about wearing the label. It was about what you did with the attention it brought. One afternoon, she found herself back at Denver International for a connecting flight. It had been almost a year since the incident. She wasn't expecting anything, just another layover, another cup of airport coffee. But as she walked past the gate, she saw a poster framed on the wall. It was a photo, taken from a distance, of United 847s landing, the F-22s flanking it like guardians. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "In honor of the crew, passengers, and responders of United 847, and to the woman in seat 13F, whose presence reminded us that courage is not a uniform, but a choice." She stopped, reading it twice. The terminal noise went on around her. Boarding calls, rolling luggage, laughter. She felt a quiet, steady warmth in her chest. That night, flying home in a window seat, she looked out at the curve of the earth under the fading light. The hum of the engines was steady, the kind of sound that settles into your bones. Her thoughts drifted to Robert Kim's handshake, Maria Santos' words, the boy in the red hoodie, the salute on the tarmac she realized she'd been carrying. All of them with her like small lights in the dark. It wasn't about the landing anymore. It was about what happened after, the ripples, the quiet changes no one else would see. Somewhere over Kansas, she closed her eyes and remembered a moment. From years ago, standing on a flight line overseas as a younger pilot asked her how to stay calm under pressure. She told him, "You don't. You just focus on the next thing you can do right." That's what United 847 had been, a chain of next right things. Until the danger was behind them, the flight touched down just after dusk. As she stepped into the terminal, she caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the glass. Not the younger pilot in the recruitment posters, not the colonel in the press photos, but simply a woman moving forward. She smiled, just a little, at her own reflection. Later, sitting in her quiet kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. The world outside was still, the kind of stillness that comes before the night settles in. Fully, she thought about all the noise of that day in Denver. The roar of engines, the radio calls, the crowd on the tarmac, and how, eventually, it had all faded into this quiet, steady breath. And she realized something she'd been circling for months. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't the act itself. It's carrying it quietly afterward, without needing it to be seen, without needing it to be celebrated. She set down the glass, walked to the back door, and stepped outside. Above her, the sky was clear, stars scattered in sharp points of light. Somewhere far overhead, another flight was cutting through the darkness, the passengers oblivious to the fact that their safety might one day rest in the hands of someone like the woman in 13F. She hoped they would never know the difference. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.